What happens when a wealthy passenger belittles his Uber driver, assuming he's just another face in the crowd? Little does he know, the man he's insulting holds a secret so powerful it will flip the entire ride and his life upside down. Marcus Hill adjusted his rearview mirror, his calm, steady demeanor, a stark contrast to the bustling downtown chaos surrounding him. At 38, Marcus had spent years navigating the roads of the city, balancing his job as an Uber driver with a quiet passion project, a nonprofit organization aimed at mentoring underprivileged youth in his community. For Marcus, every ride was an opportunity to connect with people and gain insights that would help him in his life's mission. As his phone buzzed with a new ride request, Marcus accepted it, glancing at the pickup location, a swanky downtown office building. Moments later, Richard Calloway strode out, briefcase in hand, his tailored suit and confident stride exuding wealth and entitlement. Marcus greeted him with a polite nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Calloway." Richard barely acknowledged him, waving dismissively as he slid into the back seat. "Just get me to the Heights Tower. Don't take forever," he said, his tone clipped and impatient. Marcus remained calm, easing the car into traffic. It wasn't the first time he had encountered someone like Richard, a person who equated his profession with his worth. "Nice car," Richard remarked sarcastically after a few minutes, eyeing the dashboard with a smirk. "Not exactly a luxury ride, but I guess it gets the job done." Marcus responded with a neutral hum, refusing to rise to the bait. Richard leaned back, shaking his head. "Must be tough, huh? Driving people around all day. Ever thought about doing something more ambitious?" The words hung in the air, a veiled insult cloaked in feigned curiosity. Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel, but kept his expression neutral. He had faced comments like this before, ignorant assumptions that underestimated the layers of his life and the depth of his aspirations. As the car wove through the city, Richard continued his monologue, throwing out unsolicited advice about improving one's station in life. His tone was patronizing, his questions invasive. Marcus stayed composed, silently reflecting on the irony of the situation. Here was a man who judged people solely by appearances, oblivious to the complexities of the very individual he was belittling. By the time they reached their destination, Marcus had endured a barrage of condescension. "You should really think about aiming higher," Richard said, stepping out of the car. "Thanks for the ride." "I guess." Marcus watched him go, his calm exterior betraying none of the irritation simmering underneath. Little did Richard know, this interaction would soon lead to an unforgettable lesson in humility. The midday sun gleamed against the city's high-rise buildings as Marcus Hill drove through the congested streets. In the back seat, Richard Calloway lounged with an air of entitlement, oblivious to the world outside his finely tailored suit and the Uber he deemed beneath him. "So, Marcus," Richard began, his tone dripping with condescension, "how long have you been doing this?" He gestured vaguely to the car. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his voice even. "A couple of years now." Richard leaned back, adjusting his designer sunglasses. "Don't you think it's time for something better? I mean, this can't be what you dreamed of doing with your life." Marcus nodded politely, biting back the urge to engage. He had faced these kinds of comments before, assumptions about his capabilities based solely on his profession. Richard smirked, tapping on his phone. "I'm guessing college wasn't in the cards for you, huh?" The words stung, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had grown accustomed to the sharp edge of people's ignorance. As the ride progressed, Richard's comments became more pointed. "This car, it's functional, I guess," he said, running a hand over the seat's fabric. "But if you're driving clients like me, maybe invest in something a little more upscale." Marcus, his hand steady on the wheel, responded with a calm smile. "I'll keep that in mind." Moments later, Richard's phone buzzed, interrupting the one-sided conversation. He answered with an exaggerated tone of authority, clearly intending to be overheard. "Yeah, I'm about to close the deal," Richard said, his voice swelling with pride. "It's a massive contract. They'll never know what hit them once we lock it in. We're talking millions." Marcus listened quietly, filing away the details. Years of running his own ventures had taught him the value of observation. The name of the company, The nature of the deal. Richard laid it all out as if he were performing on stage. When the call ended, Richard turned his attention back to Marcus. Anyway, like I was saying, you should really think about aiming higher. There's more to life than just chauffeuring people around. They reached Richard's destination, an upscale corporate building that gleamed with affluence. As Marcus pulled up to the curb, Richard handed him a minimal tip, smirking as he stepped out. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his tone patronizing. "Good luck with whatever this is." Marcus accepted the tip with grace, his composed demeanor never wavering. "You have a good day, sir," he replied, watching as Richard strode toward the building. As the car door closed, Marcus allowed himself a brief smile. He had endured Richard's arrogance, but little did the businessman know this would not be their last interaction. Marcus had a plan, and Richard was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The midday sun gleamed against the city's high-rise buildings as Marcus Hill drove through the congested streets. In the back seat, Richard Calloway lounged with an air of entitlement, oblivious to the world outside his finely tailored suit and the Uber he deemed beneath him. "So, Marcus," Richard began, his tone dripping with condescension, "how long have you been doing this?" He gestured vaguely to the car. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his voice even. "A couple of years now." Richard leaned back, adjusting his designer sunglasses. "Don't you think it's time for something better? I mean, this can't be what you dreamed of doing with your life." Marcus nodded politely, biting back the urge to engage. He had faced these kinds of comments before, assumptions about his capabilities based solely on his profession. Richard smirked, tapping on his phone. "I'm guessing college wasn't in the cards for you, huh?" The words stung, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had grown accustomed to the sharp edge of people's ignorance. As the ride progressed, Richard's comments became more pointed. "This car, it's functional, I guess," he said, running a hand over the seat's fabric. "But if you're driving clients like me, maybe invest in something a little more upscale?" Marcus, his hand steady on the wheel, responded with a calm smile. "I'll keep that in mind." Moments later, Richard's phone buzzed, interrupting the one-sided conversation. He answered with an exaggerated tone of authority, clearly intending to be overheard. "Yeah, I'm about to close the deal," Richard said, his voice swelling with pride. "It's a massive contract. They'll never know what hit them once we lock it in. We're talking millions." Marcus listened quietly, filing away the details. Years of running his own ventures had taught him the value of observation, the name of the company, the nature of the deal. Richard laid it all out as if he were performing on stage. When the call ended, Richard turned his attention back to Marcus. "Anyway, like I was saying, you should really think about aiming higher. There's more to life than just chauffeuring people around." They reached Richard's destination, an upscale corporate building that gleamed with affluence. As Marcus pulled up to the curb, Richard handed him a minimal tip, smirking as he stepped out. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his tone patronizing. "Good luck with whatever this is." Marcus accepted the tip with grace, his composed demeanor never wavering. "You have a good day, sir," he replied, watching as Richard strode toward the building. As the car door closed, Marcus allowed himself a brief smile. He had endured Richard's arrogance, but little did the businessman know this would not be their last interaction. Marcus had a plan, and Richard was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The morning air was crisp as Marcus Hill slid into the driver's seat of his car, ready for another day of rides. A notification popped up on his phone, signaling a new request. His brow lifted slightly when he saw the name, Richard Calloway. Marcus chuckled to himself. Life, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of timing. He accepted the ride, this time feeling a quiet resolve. Yesterday's encounter had left an impression, not because of Richard's condescension, but because of the opportunity it presented. Marcus was ready. When Marcus pulled up to the pickup location, Richard strode out of a posh apartment complex with the same air of entitlement. He entered the car without a greeting, scrolling through his phone. "Morning, Mr. Calloway," Marcus said with his usual calm. Yeah, Richard muttered, dismissively waving his hand. "Let's get going. I've got a meeting in 30 minutes, and I can't be late." Marcus nodded and pulled into traffic. The ride began much like the previous one, with Richard making dismissive comments about Marcus's choice of career. You really ought to think about doing something more meaningful, Richard remarked, glancing up from his phone. This one driving thing can't be your end goal. Marcus remained composed, offering nothing more than a polite smile. As they hit a stretch of clear road, he decided to shift the tone. So, Mr. Calloway, Marcus began casually, how did your meeting go yesterday? Big deal, wasn't it? Richard froze for a split second, his phone lowering slightly. What do you mean? Well, Marcus continued, his voice calm and measured. You were on the phone discussing some multi-million-dollar contract. Sounded important. Richard's brows furrowed, his demeanor shifting. How would you know about that? Marcus shrugged lightly. You weren't exactly subtle about it. Hard not to overhear. Richard cleared his throat, brushing off his unease. Well, I'm sure you wouldn't understand the details of something like that. Maybe not, Marcus replied, his tone neutral. But I did hear something about projected figures and market expansion strategies. Interesting approach. Richard's head whipped around to look at Marcus directly. For the first time, his arrogance faltered. And how exactly do you know about those terms? Oh, you'd be surprised what you pick up along the way, Marcus said with a small smile, his eyes fixed on the road. The car grew quiet, the tension palpable. Richard's mind raced as he tried to make sense of Marcus's knowledge. It wasn't just the words, it was the confidence with which he spoke them. As they neared the destination, Marcus added another layer of intrigue. By the way, he said, glancing briefly in the rearview mirror, I'll be heading to a meeting later today as well. It's in a similar industry, actually. Richard's unease deepened. A meeting? What kind of meeting? Oh, just something involving potential investments and partnerships, Marcus replied, keeping his tone light. Richard leaned forward slightly, his suspicion growing. What exactly do you do besides this driving gig? Marcus smirked faintly. A little bit of everything. You'd be surprised. The rest of the ride was marked by silence, save for the faint hum of the car's engine. By the time they arrived at Richard's destination, a sleek office tower, Richard stepped out with a mix of confusion and unease. Good luck with your meeting, Mr. Calloway, Marcus said with a polite nod. Richard hesitated, then walked into the building without a word. As Marcus drove away, his mind was already focused on the next step. He knew the boardroom he'd be entering later that day was one where Richard's presence and his prejudices would be irrelevant in the face of hard-earned respect and undeniable success. Marcus watched Richard disappear into the sleek corporate office building, his demeanor unchanged as he parked his car in a nearby lot. He adjusted his tie, glanced at his watch, and grabbed a leather portfolio from the passenger seat. It was time. Walking into the same building, Marcus strode through the glass doors with a quiet confidence. The front desk staff greeted him warmly, addressing him by name. He exchanged pleasantries before taking the elevator to the top floor. Meanwhile, Richard sat in a high-end conference room, preparing for what he assumed would be a routine meeting. He fiddled with his cufflinks, scanning through his notes and mentally rehearsing his pitch. His previous arrogance remained intact, bolstered by his assumption of superiority. As the meeting began, Richard launched into his presentation, outlining his ambitious plans for the high-stakes business deal he had been boasting about during the ride. The board members listened politely, though some exchanged skeptical glances. Midway through Richard's pitch, the conference room door opened. Marcus entered, his polished suit and commanding presence in stark contrast to the Uber driver Richard thought he knew. The room shifted. Board members sat straighter, nodding respectfully at Marcus. Richard froze mid-sentence, his jaw slack as he watched Marcus take a seat at the head of the table. Good afternoon, everyone, Marcus said, his voice calm but authoritative. Apologies for being late. I had another engagement to wrap up. Richard's mind raced. His disbelief quickly turned to embarrassment as he realized the man he had belittled was not only part of the meeting but clearly held a position of power. The board chair introduced Marcus. As most of you know, Marcus Hill is one of our key investors and a driving force behind this project. His input has been instrumental in shaping our vision. Richard's heart sank. The man he had mocked as just a driver was in reality a successful entrepreneur whose opinion held more weight than his own. Marcus turned his gaze to Richard, his expression composed. Mr. Calloway, he began, I believe you were in the middle of your presentation. Please continue. Richard stammered, struggling to regain his composure. He fumbled through the remainder of his pitch, his confidence crumbling under Marcus's steady gaze. When Richard finished, Marcus leaned forward, his voice measured. Thank you for your insights, Mr. Calloway. I'd like to offer some feedback. Marcus proceeded to dissect Richard's proposal, highlighting areas where his assumptions were flawed and suggesting improvements that reflected his deep understanding of the industry. The board members nodded in agreement, their respect for Marcus evident. Richard, shrinking in his seat, attempted to apologize after the meeting. Mr. Hill, I didn't realize who you were. Marcus raised a hand to stop him. It's not about who I am, Mr. Calloway. It's about how you treat people, regardless of their position. Respect shouldn't depend on assumptions. The board members, overhearing the exchange, exchanged disapproving glances at Richard's behavior. It was clear that his reputation had taken a hit. As Marcus left the room, his calm demeanor intact, Richard was left to grapple with the consequences of his arrogance. The experience had humbled him in a way he hadn't anticipated, leaving a lasting impression not just on him, but on everyone who witnessed the interaction. The day after the pivotal meeting, the story of Marcus Hill's dual identity began to spread like wildfire through corporate circles and social media. Articles and posts praised him for his humility and ingenuity, marveling at how a successful entrepreneur and key investor used driving as a way to stay connected to people from all walks of life. Marcus became a symbol of the value of hard work, empathy, and respect, and his story resonated with millions. Employees and executives from various industries reached out to Marcus, commending his character and seeking advice on how to foster dignity and inclusion within their organizations. Marcus, ever composed, embraced the attention not for personal gain, but as an opportunity to shed light on the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their profession or background. Meanwhile, Richard Calloway found himself at the center of a different kind of attention. Word of his condescending behavior toward Marcus and the subsequent fallout spread among his peers and clients. His professional reputation, once bolstered by confidence and charisma, was now under scrutiny. Richard's colleagues began to question his judgment, and a few clients withdrew their business, citing concerns about his attitude and leadership. For the first time in his career, Richard was forced to reflect on his actions. The stark contrast between his behavior and Marcus's grace was a wake-up call. Determined to change, he signed up for leadership and diversity seminars, immersing himself in lessons about empathy, respect, and the power of inclusive practices. At the same time, Marcus's influence extended far beyond the boardroom. Invitations poured in for him to speak at conferences and workshops. In his talks, Marcus shared his story, not just about his rise in the business world, but about the humanity he witnessed every day as a driver. He emphasized that no job or person was too small to deserve dignity and kindness. His words inspired change, and many companies adopted new policies aimed at promoting respect and inclusivity in the workplace. Marcus's nonprofit organization, which had been a passion project, gained increased support and funding, allowing him to expand its reach and mentor even more underprivileged youth. As the company Marcus had invested in thrived under his leadership, it became a model for modern business practices. Profits soared, employee satisfaction improved, and its public image transformed into one of innovation and integrity. Marcus's vision of a workplace where talent and respect coexisted had become a reality. Richard, on the other hand, worked quietly to rebuild his reputation. He reached out to Marcus personally, not just to apologize, but to seek guidance. Marcus, ever gracious, accepted his apology and offered advice, emphasizing that change was a process that required humility and commitment. Over time, Richard began to implement what he learned. His interactions with colleagues became more respectful, and his efforts to advocate for inclusivity earned him tentative trust within the business community. Though the road to redemption was long, Richard's willingness to grow marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The transformation of both men became a widely discussed narrative in corporate and personal development spheres. Marcus's story was celebrated for its lessons in resilience, humility, and the power of integrity, while Richard's journey served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of arrogance and the potential for redemption. In the end, both men emerged changed, Marcus as a beacon of leadership and humanity, and Richard as a man working to right his wrongs and redefine his place in the world. Months later, the grand hall of a prestigious networking event buzzed with conversations among industry leaders and innovators. Marcus Hill, now a celebrated figure in both business and philanthropy, stood near a display highlighting his nonprofit's achievements. Dressed in a tailored suit and exuding quiet confidence, he greeted attendees with his signature warmth and humility. Across the room, Richard Calloway hesitated as he spotted Marcus. The once arrogant businessman looked different, less ostentatious, more introspective. Richard had spent the past months reflecting on his behavior, attending seminars on leadership and respect, and working to rebuild his reputation. He knew this moment was inevitable and approached Marcus cautiously. "Mr. Hill," Richard began, his voice steady but tinged with humility, "I owe you an apology, not just for how I treated you, but for the assumptions I've carried for far too long." Marcus turned to face him, his expression neutral but open. "Mr. Calloway," he replied, his tone calm. Richard continued, his words deliberate. "I was wrong to judge you, or anyone, for that matter, based on superficial assumptions. You've shown me the importance of respect and humility. I'm truly sorry." A brief silence followed, but it was not uncomfortable. Marcus studied Richard's demeanor, sensing the sincerity behind his words. With a small nod, Marcus extended his hand. "Apology accepted," he said. "Acknowledging mistakes is the first step toward growth." The two men shook hands, a gesture witnessed by several attendees nearby. The interaction, though brief, symbolized a turning point for both men. As the event progressed, Marcus was approached by several industry leaders eager to collaborate on initiatives promoting equity and inclusion. His influence continued to grow, not just as a successful entrepreneur, but as a voice for change. Richard, meanwhile, quietly resolved to carry forward the lessons he had learned. Though his journey was far from over, he was committed to becoming a better leader and a better person. The story concluded with Marcus walking confidently toward the stage to deliver a keynote address. His message was simple but powerful. Respect and kindness transcend status and occupation. As the crowd applauded, Richard watched, inspired to embrace the same values in his own life.